I'll start off with my personal thought process. It started off with racism and the affect of racism. Not affect, affect. Which is, in this racism, it's a historically novel idea that favoritism toward white people, especially by white people, is a terrible thing. It's only very recently that racism as an affect came into being, where white people started to come to believe in racism. Now, this is a little complicated because if you ask anyone about racism who deeply believes in the notion of racism, they'll say race-based discrimination is bad, but in practice we know it's unidirectional, it's targeted against whites, and we've been over that at length. There's, we're starting from that premise. We're not building up to that premise here. Now, because this concept of racism isn't natural, because nobody's naturally offended by in-group preferences, racism has to be constructed. And this is seen when looking at smaller groups or private groups, one of which is family, a far narrower and even more genetically exclusive group than a race or even an ethnicity, which tends to be more genetically exclusive than race most of the time. Sometimes there's mixture, but usually an ethnicity is even more genetically exclusive than one of the traditional races. But the family is one of these categories, one which to this day confers orders of magnitude more non-meritocratic, group-based privileges. This isn't to say people have absolutely zero envy for someone who grew up in a rich family, but it's tempered. Oh, that's their group. They do things for each other, okay. Or when blacks have black-only things, or when Siberian Americans have genetically exclusive tribes with genetic requirements that you have to take a DNA test, right? It's not based on content of character or any of those pablums, right? It's genetic. You got to have the genes, right? You got to have the genes to be in the tribe. And that's not seen as horrible or evil or anything like that. If anything, it's seen as sort of a curiosity, right? So, but the fact that if white people were to do this, that this would be seen as deeply evil, that it would be the modern version of what is demonic, that is evident, that sort of goes back to, one, that this is not a natural reaction to have to, genetic-based exclusivity. That people aren't naturally offended by that. They have to be told to be. But it's also evidence that that racism is targeted at one group. That the whole racism affect, the racism thought box, is targeted against whites. So it's evidence of both of those things. Or say when Norway gives all citizens money because Norway has a lot of oil relative to the population of Norway. You say, oh, Norway just gave everyone, $50,000 or something or whatever. You may get a little bit jealous at that, but you don't see it as some grand injustice. All right? And we need to sort of understand the difference between being a little bit jealous about someone having the nicer car or the nicer thing or getting a $50,000 check from the government just because they're a Norwegian. We need to differentiate, that sort of jealousy from sort of a deep-seated idea that this is a great injustice, right? And those are two very different things. And you can also see this at the university level. Some universities give their students better stuff than other universities. Better dorm rooms, better food, in theory, better instruction, but in reality, quality of instruction on a topic is virtually irrelevant. And this is something that I've shown at length, that school quality doesn't matter. Voucher studies show that, what college someone goes to has no influence on how well they do on the bar. Like, how well you do on the bar is predicted by your SAT scores going into college. It doesn't matter if you went to Yale or Oklahoma State. It's going to be the goes-intos, right? The university itself, they all teach basically the same thing. So the school quality doesn't matter, but it's perceived to matter, right? And that's important when looking at sort of the idea that it could be an injustice that someone gets to go to a better university where they got better instruction, that there's a perception that they get better instruction, and yet they might be a little bit jealous at that, but that's not perceived as a great injustice among most people. And now that may be starting to change because people are being told to see that as a great injustice. But the fact that that is changing is evidence that there was a point prior that they did not see that as an injustice, that they did not see the inequality in school quality as an important thing, as a meaningful thing. They had to be told, right? It had to be imprinted upon them that this is a horrible thing, beyond just base, petty jealousy. This is also seen in, say, sports teams. This is kind of a very small issue, but some teams get to recruit better players, right? Alabama can recruit better players than Arkansas, but Arkansas still plays Alabama every year, and they don't cry about having worse players. Okay, that there's not some they don't have like a justice movement about that because they're not told to, right? It's not imprinted upon them that this is a horrible thing. Right, and that's not a genetic distinction. University of Arkansas versus University of Alabama. And the players, especially from the SEC, they're all black, right? So it's not like some genetic thing, but it is sort of a clannish exclusion, right? The university being effectively a clan, right? So you have sort of clannish exclusion, clannish monopoly on certain players. And clannish monopoly basically on the recruiting tables, but that's not seen as that's not brought up as some great horrible thing. That it is an inequality that is easily tolerated. In order to get people to become intolerant of that inequality, it has to be imprinted upon that this is really, really bad and immoral and wrong. So it simply doesn't exist as an issue. And won't exist as an issue until someone tries to imprint upon people that it's a big issue. So in order for things to become an issue, they must be constructed, right? Like, for example, in the U.S., you have Indian Americans I don't know if they're the richest identifiable group, ethnicity, race, but they're near the top. I don't know if they're maybe like the richest people in the U.S. may be like, Coptic Jews from Macedonia or something weird like that. But Indians are sort of a bigger group, and they're near the top, right? And and one of the reasons that they're so wealthy is because they network ethnically. They don't give to charity; they give to each other. Like, everything is passed on. They set up their economic networks to buy from each other, so everything they buy helps the ethnicity. It stays in the ethnicity. They're not free flowing. They're not shopping for like the best price on things, right? That's stupid. That's how you lose in group conflict, is you do the whole individualist thing. Okay, what they do is they network with each other. They hire each other. They buy from each other. And so even if they get slightly higher prices or slightly lower quality of work, whatever, arguably, I'm not even sure if that's true, but even if they do, that's going to be way more than offset by the fact that every dollar you're spending on your employees is going to you in a larger sense, that it's going into your ethnicity. All of your investments go into your ethnicities, right? You don't earn a wage and then blow your money out to the four winds by buying stuff from Walmart. You buy from, or if you do buy from a Walmart, you buy from a Walmart owned by one of your co-ethnic. Okay, so that's them being smart. And this isn't seen as some great injustice or terrible thing. This is seen as something of a curiosity. This is seen as, that's a very curious way for them to behave, and it's very successful. But when whites do that, and when whites did that, that was then made into a horrible thing. And that's because, and it had to be constructed, right? It wasn't like white ethnic networks. White exclusionary ethnic networks were not seen as a terrible thing until there was a campaign to do so. It had to be constructed, right? And so all this has to be constructed, either which is through mass media, or through the pulpit of teaching positions at pre-college and into college. Okay, these concerns about inequality or perceived unfairness between groups, they have to be ginned up. They have to be fabricated inside of you in order for, 95% of people to care at all. And I'm also thinking, like when the Romans invaded barbarian lands in Gaul, for example, modern day France, there weren't either any, shit-libby Romans or barbarians decrying the unfairness of the contest. How the Romans, they had professional soldiers who trained year-round, while the barbarians, they were mostly conscripts who, if lucky, they had a month of training before, they were on the march. Or how Roman equipment was all superior at almost every level to a very meaningful degree. The idea that what the Romans were doing to the people in Gaul was unfair, it didn't even enter the minds of anyone there to so much as consider. It wasn't even like, what do you mean unfair? Sure. Like, what? Like, the world is the world. Group fights group. You fight with what you have. So to make concerns about unfairness, like an unfairness of a contest or unfairness of quality of life between groups, to make that into an issue, it's not something that is natural. It has to be constructed. It has to be impressed upon people. And if you can impress upon other groups a kind of fairness doctrine that they can't go around and stomp on weaker groups and exploit them, well, you have now critically weakened that group. And if you maintain those sort of ethnic advantages for yourself, if you're, completely mercenary, if you're completely, take advantage of whoever you want, preserve your ethnic economic networks, but deny them and convince your enemy to deny them to himself, to deny all these advantages to themselves, well, you've just conned somebody pretty fucking hard. Now, as for fairness within groups, that has always been a cup of trembling. People have always been concerned about inequality within their own nation, race, clan, whatever. But they don't really care about between group inequality, at least not naturally. And to the extent they care about it, they see it more as like a threat. Like, oh, this group is getting wealthy. Wealth, it's not a one-to-one relation between wealth and power, but wealth can enable power. Like if you have more money, you can pay more professional soldiers, you can buy better equipment. Okay, so wealth does translate to power to some degree. Okay? But they don't look at it like, oh, these people have nicer lives. I'm mad about that. These people on the other side of the world have nicer lives. I'm mad that they have nicer lives than me. That's unnatural. That has to be ginned up in people to get them to care about that. They have to be fed some sort of worldview where that is a horrible thing. So I think I've adequately established that racism or concern about racism has to be constructed. There's more in-depth work on this. There's, we can look at the behavior of infants. We can look at the behavior of very young children, what they say, what they think, how they act, as evidence that, and by young children, I mean children reaching like age 5, and they say, okay, here's a picture of girls. And there's like, and they're on a continuum of skin color. Like, which girl is the liar? Which girl tells the truth? And if they're a white child, they'll point to the light-skinned girl and say, the light-skinned girl is telling you. And now, of course, that's actually probabilistically true, right? That black people do, in fact, lie more in any survey, any quantitative analysis where the respondent has the potential to lie, blacks lie more. So, like, it's actually true. But, the little kids may or may not know that. They're just going off of their instinct. And their instinct is to have favorable attitudes towards people who look like them, right? And this has to be drilled out of them. So that's another piece of evidence that the idea of racism is unnatural. That the racism box, the racism thought box, the racism construct is entirely constructed. It is a construct, so it is constructed. Right? It's not something that exists organically. So at the outset, knowing nothing about whether concern about racism is natural or constructed, you should be going into it 50-50. Right? You shouldn't have a strong opinion. You shouldn't be thinking, oh, racism has to be taught. I know this. No, it should be, you should go into it with a 50-50 attitude, right? And the fact that, everyone in your society is deeply concerned about racism, right, is no more evidence that racism concern is natural than the fact that everybody in your society is Christian or Muslim is evidence that Christianity or Islam is natural. That's that's an example where it's very clearly not natural. Christianity and Islam are very clearly constructed. I don't think anyone would possibly deny that, except the most lunatic fundamentalists. But so the fact that it's omnipresent that doesn't mean anything to whether it's natural or not. Well, the fact that something is omnipresent is evidence that it is natural, unless you can look back in time. And if you look back in time and you see, oh, nearly all of history before this point, people didn't think in terms of racism. They didn't think about racism or the racism construct. This came about, in the 20s, 30s, and particularly into high gear after World War II in the United States. Okay, this is evidence of it being constructed, that this is a belief impressed upon. Maybe in a semi-emergent way. Maybe there wasn't some, grand council of, constructing and battling racism, but it was obvious. It obviously came to be. It's not a default state to be concerned about these things. So all this tells us that the whole racism movement, it's unnatural, it's constructed, and the fact that only very specific racial inequalities, right, between group inequalities, very specific between group inequalities are the ones that are concerned about, and those just happen to be the ones that are actively pushed by institutions for you to care about, that makes it even more likely that any of this is natural, that any of this racism concern is natural. Okay, so now don't assume a point here that I'm not actually making. I did not say it's unnatural, therefore bad and wrong. It is bad and wrong because it is unnatural. All things that are unnatural are bad and wrong. No, I did not say that, so don't assume that is my point. However, the point that this racism concern or racism thought thing is in fact an unnatural constructed thing, that's important in terms of how we look at it, right? That racism thought, racism concern, that's constructed. That is, and it is a historically contextual thing. It hinges on contingencies, right? Okay, so that's the first thing I noticed, is that all these indicators that racism thought is unnatural and constructed. It's an ideology, it's synthetic, it must be actively impressed upon you. That this is something that you must care about. That's why it doesn't generalize. The only racial inequalities you care about are those which you are told to care about. Now, when I talk to racism, and I'm in their face and putting them on the spot, sure, they'll sort of feign consistency and say they're against all racial inequality in some generalized, principled sense. But as soon as a guy like me is not in their face, they go back to harping on and promoting concern only about racial inequalities that favor whites. That's it. For example, they'll never talk about Jewish privilege being unfair. They'll never talk about exclusive Asian economic networks or anything like that. They'll never talk about how bad it is that, Siberian Americans have genetically exclusive semi-autonomous territories. If racism was some natural thing, you'd see European Americans concerned about racial inequalities in which they are at the lower end of things, right?